The King's Labyrinth. Book 1. The Acknowledged. Prologue. The well-built, black-haired man walked around the outside of the tower. He ignored the main entrance so he could inspect the ivy that wove itself within the stonework. Bodies hung from it, as if to warn its visitors of the trials that lay within and what happened to those who failed to overcome them. He ran his sepia hands along the wall, then pulled from his pocket a small, ornate copper key that reflected the light of the sun into a straight line, guiding him towards the secret door. This was one of his 3 keys, the key of guidance. The key glowed and the door opened. He turned towards his apprentice, Fuarta. The purple-haired child, perhaps no more than 12, though the man was unaware of his exact age, stood at attention immediately. "Yes, Azrafel?" Azrafel smiled softly at him. "Would you like to come in with me?" The boy's eyes lit up. He had never been invited inside before. Fuarta nodded, eager to prove himself. "Yes, sir!" He drew his sword from his scabbard and readied himself for any trials that lay within. Azrafel headed inside, katana at the ready. His apprentice quickly followed, and the moment they were both through, the door closed behind them. They were left in complete darkness. They waited for a moment. Azrafel tried to let his eyes adjust to the lack of light, but they never did. He sighed in minor defeat. He preferred moving through dim light as it was. Light attracted unwanted attention. However, this was darkness in its purest form, and it left him with no other choice. "Fuarta, light one of the torches," Azrael whispered. His quiet voice somehow echoed off the walls with an eerie belligerence. He grimaced. So much for stealth. Fuarta lit the torch and handed it to Azrafel. Both men were careful not to voice another thought, in hopes to remain unnoticed as they ventured further. As they moved forward, the same vines that had wrapped around the stonework outside of the tower also lined the inner passages. It was a labyrinth, which for an ordinary adventurer might pose a challenge, but Azrafel need only bring out his key of guidance. "Azrafel," a voice in the back of his head whispered. He wasn't fazed and continued forward. He knew that voice all too well. "Yes, Alexander," he thought, making sure not to say any words out loud lest to give their positioning away. "This key is very hostile. I can sense it." "Aren't they all?" He smirked slightly. Alexander was himself a key, the key of lightning, so his words were already proven false, for Alexander was one of Azrafel's dearest friends. Alex's laugh radiated throughout his mind, and Azrafel couldn't help but smile. "Not all of us. I like to think I'm more on the playful side." Azrafel held back an audible chuckle. "That you are, my dear friend. So, how hostile is hostile?" "Well, I mean, enough to hang up corpses on the outside of the tower? That sort of hostile?" "I see. I'm just saying that you should be careful. Be prepared for anything." "Aren't I always?" Fuarta nudged his mentor, hoping to break through his internal thoughts. He pointed at some markings on the wall. They were most likely a beast of some sort. Azrafel forced himself to stop paying attention to Alexander. He was a distraction right now, which could cost him and Fuarta's life. Though it was good to know that the key was a hostile one, it would probably be more reluctant to give itself to me, since that was the case. Azrafel noticed the beast marks that Fuarta pointed out. He ran his hands along the markings, trying to figure out what creature it could be. 3 jagged lines that looked like scratch marks. He moved the torch closer to the wall and saw bits of dried blood within the crevices of the marks. It was probably a while since anyone had last passed through this tower. The beast would be hungry. It was best to continue onwards with more caution. Alex spoke in his mind once more. "The creatures are hostile too." "Creatures? There's more than one of them," he thought back. Alex nodded within the mindscape. "Yes, but that's all I could gather from Christopher." Azrafel sighed, and the key of guidance, also known as Christopher, was never wrong about these things. He'd have to proceed with even further caution. He remained constantly on the lookout for anything that could hint towards some sort of beast. Claw marks were everywhere. It was impossible to tell if any of them were fresh. They were completely sporadic in placements as well. It seemed that the beast had no preference for location, but simply preferred to tear its victims apart regardless of where they were in the maze. It also seemed that the beast had more than 3 claws, which caused a fluctuation in the number of claw marks in different areas within the tunnel. Azrafel continued onwards. Really, that was all he could do, keeping silent to his steps. As far as he could tell, these tunnels held no external sound in and of themselves, and the great beasts clearly moved with such stealth that they might rival the greatest of thieves. As they followed the key of guidance, the vines became more sporadic. No longer did they only subtly weave between the stonework, but they now also crawled their way in thick bundles along the floor. Movement slowed. Azrafel knew the type of games these towers played, and if this key was hostile, it'd use every resource it had at its disposal to get rid of them. Silence was key, and every step needed to be trod carefully. The vines were there for a reason, probably to ensnare their victims, so Azrafel was careful to avoid even a light touch to the greenery. Fuarta, however, did not share this knowledge. He followed Azrafel's footsteps clumsily, not quite being able to avoid the vines like his mentor. But nothing seemed to happen, so he didn't pay any mind to it. A few times Azrafel looked back at Fuarta and held a finger to his lips. They continued on like that. The only sound were that of Fuarta's footsteps and the shifting of something. Azrafel paused, then held out his arm to stop Fuarta in his tracks, blocking out the young boy's footfalls as he listened. Where there had previously been silence, he now heard something that shifted behind them, trailed them, approached slowly, but with a presence that grew in Azrafel's mind. He presumed it was the creature, and turned around, katana at the ready. Before him, a dense wall of vines moved towards them, ready to ensnare and trap them in their grasp, or more likely, hang them from the walls of the tower's exterior. Now he realized that there had never been any claw marks. The sharp thorns of the enchanted plants must have caused all the marks on the wall's interior. The plant must be stronger than your typical one, the thorns far more deadly. Fuarta held out his sword and readied himself for an attack, but Azrafel murmured, "Wait." Azrafel tested a theory. He held out the torch to the wall of vines, and the living plants recoiled from the warmth of the flame. "Take out more torches from the pack," he murmured to Fuarta, and the young apprentice did so immediately. Fuarta looked at Azrafel for guidance on what to do once the torches were out, but he just gave the boy an encouraging smile, so Fuarta took a deep breath and lit another one of the torches, then held it out towards the ivy. The plants recoiled once again from the heat. He looked towards Azrafel once more for guidance, or some sort of indication that he was doing the right thing. The same smile played upon Azrafel's face. It did not give anything away, but encouraged Fuarta to make some sort of decision. "Move!" Alex all but yelled. The voice echoed within Azrafel's mind. "Wait," he thought back calmly. "I want to see what the boy does." Fuarta sighed and looked at the green wall and charged forwards with the torch. He waved the fire around uselessly as the vines danced away from him. They easily dodged his sporadic movements. Azrafel watched for a moment, observed his apprentice's initial reaction before he wetted his sword with oil from his bag and set it on fire. He moved forward, swift with the blade as he cut through the enchanted vines. The vines flinched, which allowed Fuarta to touch the living plants. The flames lapped at the edges, burned the vines till they were nothing but black ash. The flames didn't stop there. They moved, followed along the tunnel vines like they were a whip. Fuarta stared in awe at the brilliant light until he felt a strong grip pull him backward. He looked around and saw Azrafel, who smiled proudly at him and gestured forward. They were no longer worried about what traps the vines might hold, so instead they ran, let the flames do the hard part. The flames burnt the vines, and as long as they stayed ahead of the flames, they would be fine. The two of them followed the key of guidance as far as they could. However, it led them to a dead end with no more than a crack in the wall, one that would most definitely not fit a grown man, especially one of Azrafel's stature. But Fuarta could fit. "Go," Azrafel spoke calmly as Fuarta looked up at him in worry. "But the flames," he responded, voice edged with nervous energy. Azrafel gave him a steady smile. "It'll be a while before the flames catch up with me, and by the time they do, I expect you to have completed this tower." Fuarta stared up at him in awe. "Go," Azrafel repeated, and Fuarta squeezed himself between the cracks. He didn't have any faith in himself. This was the very first tower he'd been allowed to go into, but he promised himself that he'd complete it and make Azrafel proud. Fuarta arrived on the other side of the wall a moment later. He looked around and saw an empty room. It confused him. There were no paths that led out of this room. There were no treasures to hint that he had reached the top of the tower. There was nothing. Not even the vines lingered here. He walked around the empty room and examined the stonework, desperate to find a piece to the non-existent puzzle that would lead him onward. He eventually sighed and reached out with his voice. "Hello?" A foreign voice echoed back, "Hello." Fuarta tripped over his feet in surprise, then tumbled to the ground as he looked around frantically. "Who's there?" "Who's there?" the voice repeated. He stayed silent for a moment, then responded, "My name's Fuarta. What's yours?" There was no response this time. Fuarta sighed. "Who are you?" This time he heard a rustle of leaves, yet when he looked around there was still nothing in the room, but the voice echoed him once again. "Who are you?" He sighed. Fuarta didn't know what game this voice wanted to play. He couldn't afford to waste time. Not if he wanted to make sure Azrafel was okay. Not if he wanted to complete this tower. He closed his eyes and paid attention to the energy of the room. Fuarta heard a slight rustle coming from somewhere, but he still couldn't locate where. "I am an adventurer." "Who are you?" the voice repeated. Fuarta didn't understand what answer the voice desired, but he tried again. "I am an apprentice, a fighter of swords." The voice repeated itself once more. "Who are you?" Fuarta sighed. "Who am I?" He was just an apprentice. He had been in slavery for so long, and then Azrafel had saved him. He was whatever Azrafel wanted him to be. "I don't know." The voice grew silent, but the slight rustle of something within the room got louder. He opened his eyes and looked around. Still nothing. He closed his eyes again and listened. He heard a distant grunt coming from beyond the wall. Undeniably Azrafel. The flames must have caught up. I don't know who I am. Not really. I don't know what you want me to say. I really don't. But I need to get out of here, because my mentor is in danger and I need to help him. I can't just let things end like this." There was no response once again, but this time he heard the rustle of something around him and felt something cold and hard materializing itself in his clenched fist. Then, a rush of wind ruffled his hair as if he was outside again. He opened his eyes and the walls were gone. There in front of him was Azrafel, covered in ash and burns, unconscious. Fuarta ran over to him and knelt beside him. "Azrafel! Sir Azrafel! Wake up!" He didn't stir. Fuarta felt for a pulse and it was faint. Azrafel was alive, but not for long. He had defeated the key tower too late. And what do I have to show for it? He looked down at the intricate silver key within its grasp. Just this key. It's not worth it. He wanted to throw the key away, to bury it, to yell at it for having only presented itself after his friend was mortally injured. He screamed in frustration. "Why did you do this? Why did I think I could do this? Why did Azrafel ever believe I could defeat the key tower on time? I can't do anything. I'm worthless." He felt the key in his hand grow hot, almost like it was there solely to contradict his words. He glared down at it and noticed that it now had a pale green glow to it. "What do you want from me?" He heard the same voice from earlier echo. "What do you want from me?" Warm liquid streaked down his cheeks. He wiped the tears from his eyes with a growing defiance. "I want you to heal him." "Heal him," the voice echoed. He stared at the silver key in surprise. Wait, was this... He held it out to Azrafel's limp body and screamed, "Heal!" Vines shot out of the key and wrapped around Azrafel's wounds. They constricted him, then withered quickly away to reveal Azrafel completely void of any burns or injury. His breath came out in a careful, steady intervals, and even the hair that had been singed by the fire now framed his face, soft and healthy. He shook his mentor, and Azrafel's eyes opened abruptly. Azrafel looked up at his apprentice and smiled. "You did well." Fuarta wiped the stream of tears from his eyes once more. "I thought you were going to die." Azrafel sat up and stretched the stiffness out of his muscles. "I wouldn't die so easily." He pulled the child into a hug. "Don't worry so much, okay, Fuarta? I had every confidence that you would complete the tower." Fuarta looked down and smiled a bit. No one had ever believed in him like this before. Azrafel gazed at the younger boy softly and rustled his hair a bit. "Did you get the key?" Fuarta nodded slightly and held it up so Azrafel could see it. "Do you know what it does?" Fuarta's eyes flickered to where the burns had previously encompassed Azrafel's body, his clothing still charred and frayed from where the fire had licked his skin. "I do." Azrafel smiled a bit and ruffled Fuarta's hair again. "That's your key now." Fuarta's eyes opened wide in surprise. "But I don't deserve it. All I did was put you in danger." Azrafel looked into Fuarta's eyes. "Fuarta, the key chose you. I wouldn't be able to take it now even if you offered it to me. The key chooses its master." Fuarta stared at Azrafel in awe. "It chose me?" He looked at the little silver key, awestruck by the power he now held. "How does that even work? How can the key choose someone? Isn't it just an object? Just a piece of metal?" Alex's voice chuckled a bit in the back of Azrafel's mind, and he thought of all the keys he'd been able to talk to, all the voices that now guided his path. He gave Fuarta a soft smile. "In time you'll learn." Fuarta looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Azrafel simply replied, "In time."